Hello, everyone. It's very nice to meet you. My name is Katharina Engel. I'm the Build Project Manager at the Federal Institute for Vocational Education and Training, or much simpler, BIBB. We are based in Bonn, just like UNESCO Univoc, our partners in implementing the project, the Build project, Bridging Innovation and Learning in TVET, which I will introduce you to you very briefly now. And we will then, of course, focus on the work of our current Build expert group. Just a couple of sentences more about the Build project. The Build project is funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And the whole project is focusing on the overarching question of new qualifications and competencies in TVET. So we are asking ourselves, whatever we do, we are asking ourselves this question about how is TVET changing? And the three I's, as we call them, that you see here on the screen, the question of identification of new qualifications and competencies, of integrating them into curricula and training regulations, and also the implementation of them in teaching and training are at the core of the project activities. And in terms of themes, we are looking at the big mega trends that are changing TVET. So we are looking at greening and digitalization, also together as the so-called dual or twin transition. We are also looking at entrepreneurship and migration. And we have, as our project name already indicates, several activities that are focusing on the bridging between three regions that we are focusing on, which are Asia and the Pacific, Africa, and Europe. We are looking at innovation and knowledge generation, and we are also reinforcing learning and capacity building. And our basis for that work and our partners in that are the Univoc centers, the so-called Univoc centers. They are part of the UNESCO Univoc's global network of TVET stakeholders in those regions around the world. And I will not go into all the details of all the different activities that we have in the Build project, but we are looking specifically at the work of the Build expert groups, which are almost like a little project within the project. And about the Build expert groups, it's important to know that we are actually, as in the Build project as a whole, focusing on the three regions again. So we have representatives from Asia Pacific, from Africa, from Europe, as well as from international organizations in our expert group. And we are looking at, like in the big project, we are looking at the three levels of the stakeholders. So we are looking at TVET policy. We are also looking at all the advocacy levels, like the associations, the unions, the industry partners. And then we are also looking at TVET delivery. And all of them are represented in our expert groups. We started with the Build expert groups and actually with an expert group that more or less laid the basis for the work of the other expert groups and also for the work of the project in 2020, when we looked at this idea of the new qualifications and competencies in TVET in much more detail. So that's the first publication on the top of the slide that you can see there. That was the outcome of this expert group. So if you want to know more about that topic, definitely have a look at those publications there. And then in 2023, we had our first sector-specific expert group where we looked at the dual transition in the hospitality and tourism sector. And for that, we now also have the publications there. You can see them on the slide, also on the right in the middle. You can delve into those and see what you can probably expect towards the end, not just probably, you will expect at the end of this expert group, which is now focusing on the building and construction sector. And it's a great pleasure to closely work together with Concove here, as they are our regional lead for Asia and the Pacific, as well as the overall lead of this expert group. And as you will hear and learn more in this webinar today, they are focusing in their work together with the partners from around the world on three aspects in particular, which are the greening of TVET for the sector, the digitalization of TVET delivery in the sector, and also on the impact of migration for the building and construction sector. And without further explanations, I will hand over to Eve Price, and thank you all so much for listening that far and now going into the exciting details of the work of the Build Expert Group.
Thank you very much, Katharina. In particular, very grateful given the unfairness of the hour at which we have asked you to join us from Germany. We're very grateful for your presence here with us today. I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Manny Saini, who will be talking about the digitalization aspect of this work that we're undertaking. Manny, over to you.
Great, thanks, Eve. So why digitalization is critical for construction, technical, and vocational education and training. I think this is one of those topics that we'd all unanimously agree on and probably needs very little introduction. So just a quick summary. Construction industry is transforming rapidly. It's driven by digital innovations such as building information modeling, augmented and virtual reality, and the Internet of Things. So these tools are redefining how projects are designed, managed, and creating a critical need for digitally skilled workforce. But I'd also like to talk about how digitalization means that operations and processes are streamlined for more efficiency. So there's less wastage, so less money spent. And technology has also meant that learning can become more affordable after an initial setup cost, of course. And it's a lot more flexible, so people can learn at their own pace. So, in a world where every organization around us is taking drastic measures to cut back costs and become more efficient, digitalization has really been helping soften that blow and absorbing some of that pressure. So this makes the integration of digital skills into TVET curriculum not just important, but essential for meeting the demands of a future-ready workforce. Let's take a closer look at some of the technologies driving this transformation. So I mentioned building information modeling, or BIM, which enables project teams to visualize and sort of simulate and optimize construction processes, significantly improving efficiency. People think of a BIM model as just being sort of a 3D model of a building, but actually, when you get to the really advanced models, you can literally turn a building on. And then you can see the water flow rates, you can see what the air pressures are like, you can see temperatures, you can spot issues that may occur in the actual function of the building. So it's actually a very useful tool. Extended reality, that's an umbrella term for augmented, virtual, and mixed reality. Obviously, that provides immersive, hands-on learning environments. There's also the Internet of Things, which I'm really excited about. It connects construction equipment and systems. So it allows for sort of real-time monitoring and data collection on a construction site, enhancing both productivity and safety. And then there are, other learning tools that allow us to deliver digital learning from a distance. This is often overlooked as we use tools like Teams and Zoom daily, but the mere use of these tools through a learning process helps sharpen up a student's generic digital skills. So despite the opportunities, the path to fully digitalizing TVET is not without its challenges, as you can imagine. So one of the major hurdles is the digital divide. So many learners, particularly in rural or under-resourced areas, they lack access to digital tools and reliable internet infrastructure. And then off the back of that, the high costs of equipment and software, they pose another barrier, particularly for smaller training institutions and companies. There's also a skills gap among educators who often lack the training needed to integrate digital tools into their teaching effectively, or simply don't know enough about an emerging new technology themselves. And finally, there's resistance to change. We've all seen it, whether cultural, organizational, or logistical, and that slows the adoption of digitalization in some regions. I just want to share an anecdote. Recently, I spoke with a company here in New Zealand called Clorox. They're a real innovator. They 3D print concrete structures and houses. And they'd mentioned that to find the right generic digital skills in future employees, they'd been advertising jobs asking if the potential candidates used TikTok and Instagram. So speaking to the challenges I've listed there, it was just a great way to ensure candidates naturally had the digital skills they thought they would need for the job. So despite these challenges, there are inspiring examples of how digitalization is being implemented successfully in TVET systems around the world. So in some regions, hybrid training models have emerged where they blend online resources with in-person learning to make digital training more accessible. There's work-based learning programs, which are being enhanced with tools like BIM and augmented reality. And then there are also examples of industry collaboration. So where companies share cutting-edge technologies with training institutions to ensure students that graduate, they've got industry-relevant skills. So an example of this locally is when we have large-scale government-funded projects, like, say, a new hospital, as part of their budget, they set aside some funds to train the contractors on the new technologies that are being brought in from overseas. So to fully harness the potential of digitalization in TVET, there's 5 critical actions we should focus on. So number 1, understandably, upskilling educators. Teachers are obviously cornerstone of TVET. We need our educators to feel comfortable with the emerging technologies if they're to then teach them confidently to students. Industry collaboration, so strong partnerships between TVET providers and industry stakeholders that can ensure access to the latest tools and real-world projects. I gave you an example of that just earlier, but perhaps some government-backed policies could be developed that promoted this sort of collaboration on a regular basis. An example of that would be that in New Zealand, all government procurement in the construction sector sets aside a dollar value dedicated to training and upskilling of contractors. So this was implemented at a procurement policy level, which is just a great way. It's a great example of how we could really promote this sort of collaboration. And then there's flexible learning models, so micro-credentials and modular programs. They allow learners to obviously upskill or reskill quickly in specific technologies. This flexibility is especially valuable in the digital spaces. A lot of these technologies usually require some previous exposure within the workforce where they've seen these technologies in place, and then sort of a short burst of training to bring them up to speed. And then number 4 is investing in digital infrastructure. This one goes without saying, but it's clearly vital to address resourcing disparities, particularly in rural and under-resourced areas. And then lastly, there's standardizing digital competencies. Aligning TVET curriculum with global frameworks, such as those supporting BIM and augmented reality. This will help workers transition seamlessly across borders while ensuring they still meet industry standards. I know the BIM sector has done a lot of work in standardizing their LOD, level of detail framework, over the last 10 years or so. So it makes complete sense, right, to teach the content to a globally recognized standard. So this type of standardizing should be the aim for all digital competencies. And that's all for me, folks, and I'll hand it back to Eve.
Thank you very much, Manny. We appreciate your time and your insights. If you do have questions for Manny, please hold on to them tightly. We will work through the presentations on the 3 key themes of this work, and then there's a time at the end for questions and answers. But firstly, I'll hand over to one of our colleagues, Oren from Brands, which is the Building Research Association of New Zealand, and he's doing quite a lot of work within Brands on the greening space. So as the right opportunity for us to invite him to come and talk about his work, as it is so particularly relevant to this project with UNESCO Univoc. Oren, over to you, please.
So thank you for the introduction. You saved me a bit of time having to do that myself, so I appreciate that. Kia ora katoa, everyone. As mentioned, I'm Oren. I'm a social scientist, and my kind of area of expertise is looking at vocational education and training related to green construction, or what type of skills are required to deliver kind of green construction projects. Was there a... Oh, there we go. I get to control the slides now. That's quite exciting. First off, I just wanted to start with kind of a bit of window dressing in terms of the kind of importance of this issue. So in terms of the kind of scale of the problem, globally, the building construction sector contributes to about 21% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's already quite a large emitter of carbon emissions. But taking a bit more of a regional or a New Zealand lens to this, the graph I have here is based on some research that some of my colleagues have done at Brands on residential construction. It looks at the carbon footprinting of what a code minimum or like a regular standard house is kind of built to in terms of its carbon footprinting. So we've got 3 examples here. So if you look at the top example, the top graph, you've got the carbon footprint or the DH of a detached house. And if you look at that compared to what's currently being built now versus what we would need to build in order to meet our 2050 1.5 target, we're exceeding our carbon footprint by about 6 times. So we've got a massive amount of work to do to be able to reduce the carbon footprint of our buildings. So what does that mean for the construction process? So if we look at, apologies, I'm trying to figure out how to go to the next slide.
Is that the one there, Oren?
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. So what does a green construction process look like? Very simply, it's more about, it requires a more holistic approach to construction. So what I mean by a holistic approach to construction, it needs more coordination between your sub-trades, between your main contractor, between your architect and designer. The problem with kind of green construction and the adaptation of green construction is very much related to the fragmentation of your workforce. Like, does your workforce have the ability to be able to work together? And the reason why that's such a problem is for green construction, a number of green construction projects are attached to green certification schemes that help kind of define and guide what does green performance look like, and they have very stringent performance targets, and oftentimes expected first actual performance in green construction is let down by a lack of coordination or communication between trades, between sub-trades, between workers, between architects, designers, and project managers. There's more of an emphasis on communication and collaboration to meet these more stringent targets. I mentioned the certification schemes because schemes like Green Star in Australia and New Zealand, Homestar in New Zealand, and other certification schemes like LEED in the US or BREEAM in the UK drives a lot of the skills development in this space. The requirements of a contractor or a subcontractor to reach these targets encourages skills development in this space because it's part of the work that they're doing. The other aspect that changes quite dramatically with green construction is circular economy principles. And related to things like the types of materials that architects are ordering for sites through to the types of materials and their packaging, like what type of packaging does each new material contain? What are your waste diversion practices? How do you find ways to kind of divert your waste from landfill? There's a number of factors around circular economy that becomes kind of crucial to green construction practices. Next slide, please. So in terms of the kind of key competencies for green construction that's becoming quite prominent in this space, it all relates to the things I talked to earlier, this idea of climate literacy, which is becoming this kind of underpinning foundational knowledge that kind of stretches across the entire kind of construction sector. And what I mean by climate literacy, it's really just an understanding about what is it about your role and your work that contributes to carbon emissions, and having an understanding of what that relationship is between your work and climate change. In the New Zealand's perspective, a lot of workers, like tradespeople that we've spoken with, have a pretty good understanding of the importance of energy efficiency or the importance of diverting their waste. The next stage of this kind of learning about green construction is connecting that information around energy efficiency to that kind of wider picture of climate change. Why does my role influence the climate and carbon emissions, and what can I do about it? The other aspect with this is kind of working, communicating with other trades. As I've already mentioned, a big part of green construction is all about how you are able to work as collaboratively as large and as part of large groups. And a big part of that is understanding how your role or how your particular trade influences others when you're working in a relatively fragmented and siloed construction process. And as I've mentioned before, waste management practices are kind of crucial to this. I like to point out too that these are kind of more transversal kind of soft skills that kind of underpin the entire construction sector, but there are a number of technical, more specific skills that impact depending on the particular trade or the particular role in the construction sector. I just wanted to highlight what those kind of key areas were that cut across professional codes. Next slide, please. So in terms of challenges for delivering green competencies, I focus more on the New Zealand example, but this is very true of vocational education and training and construction sectors that deal with fragmentation. And oftentimes it's access to teachers and trainers who have experience and being able to work on sites that have green competencies as part of their work in their space. We've found that teachers and trainers kind of lack awareness in the space. And for the VET systems like New Zealand, which has a big emphasis on worksite-based training, if your employer isn't working on sites that have green construction components, and you don't have colleagues who know about this, you're not being exposed to opportunities or work sites that allow you to experience this. And we currently don't have the scope or the scale of other green construction going on where you could do work placements or learn in this particular space to help kind of grow these kind of particular competencies in this space. Next slide, please. I just wanted to end by just kind of outlining some of the current approaches to kind of incorporating green construction competencies in TVET. So I think the main thing to recognize here is there's a lot of variance in terms of how different vocational education training systems are approaching green construction. There's often a lot of constraints imposed by different vocational education systems. They influence the degree to which green construction can be incorporated in qualification standards. I would highly recommend, if you haven't already, checking out Linda Clark's work in this space. Her and her team does an absolutely fantastic job outlining a lot of different construction sectors and countries across Europe and the US in terms of how they approach green construction. But just to give you a couple of examples of maybe some of the countries that are a little bit further along in this journey. So, for example, Belgium and Germany are having it, I'm not going to say an easy time because it's not easy transitioning to green construction, but having an easier time in this space because their curriculum is already kind of partially addressing green construction competencies. They're already looking at principles around building science, energy efficiency, and sustainability. What they're doing now is just tying that together with this idea of climate literacy and what that means for the sector. There are other countries, for example, I think Ireland and Canada are really good examples of this, who are just starting their journey, where most of their vocational education and training are in green construction is focused on the kind of installation of renewable energy systems. So thinking more of your building services, and it has a very narrow technical focus. But even they're kind of expanding out their focus on green construction and these kind of and providing foundational courses that kind of address the building process, focusing more around building science principles around airtightness and insulation, climate literacy, and those transversal skills of kind of communication. I think probably the one thing I'd like to kind of leave everybody with is that the key, at least for the beginnings of kind of vocational education and training and providing education around green construction, is developing that foundational expertise around building science principles, those transversal skills around collaboration, communication, teamwork, and climate literacy, and how in green construction, those kind of concepts are becoming central to learner identities in this space. They have an ability to participate on green construction sites, and it's just finding spaces for our learners to be able to kind of learn from this, both theoretically and then also practically on the job. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. That's me.
Thank you very much, Oren. Really grateful for your time and expertise and showcasing the work that you're doing at Brands as well for the greater transition. Our final topic for today is the topic of migration, and indeed a topic very important in construction in all of the regions that this project is focusing on. Throughout some of the work that we've done with this project so far, you can see this is the mapping of the the main keywords that we're focusing on. You can see down the right-hand side the 3 key themes of digitalization, greening, and migration. And across the left-hand side, you have the transversal themes that are relevant to vocational education and training, regardless of the topic. And I'm sure these will not be uncommon to you. They focus on policy development, industry collaboration, and indeed what Oren and Manny have been focusing on, which is curriculum modernization. The aspect that I'm going to be focusing on currently is migration, and indeed looking at migration specifically in construction. So current migration trends, there's a quote here on the left-hand side. In 2020, there were around 281 million international migrants. That's about 3.6% of the global population. Within construction, we're expecting the world population to reach 10 billion by 2050. And that means that to upgrade our infrastructure, we need to be investing $2 trillion a year to reach that. And so I've spelled out 2 trillion with the correct number of zeros, just to give you a real indication of what that represents, because I don't know about you, but I don't operate in trillions of dollars on a regular basis. European Union had some great numbers for us as well. The construction sector is the 2nd largest industry ecosystem, employing 25 million people. Although the scale might be somewhat different, that's a common theme around the world of construction being one of the highest employers, and certainly one of the highest employers of migrant workers. So why are we seeing growing migration and growing demands? Well, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the various skills shortages that are being experienced worldwide. We also have rapid urbanization needs, as well as just indicated that necessary increase in spending in infrastructure. But we also have quite an aging workforce in several, if not all, of the developed nations. This obviously leads to some key challenges. We have a group of them here. The top of mind ones, obviously language and cultural barriers. So construction is a very technical industry. So there's not only the technical language required, but also the general language proficiency required to operate in the work site, but also outside of work and in the host country in general. When we add to this the requirements of complying with different legislations and different codes, that obviously increases this issue as well. Recognition of qualifications, there's a lack of standardized qualification recognition systems around the world. And because of the nature of construction, it is sometimes quite difficult to assess the informal learning that has happened on site. And then there's often a lot of complexity as well as the cost of navigating these processes. Complexity made all the more difficult if you're navigating this in a language that is not necessarily your own. Equally, we have access to training and upskilling barriers. Very often for migrant workers and refugees, there are immigration restrictions that prevent them from accessing certain training and upskilling initiatives. As well as the funding issues. Funding is often excludes migrants from participating, which again, when we talk about the need to upskill all of our workforce, for example, for digitalization and greening, that's a real issue when it comes to upskilling and reskilling the migrant workforces that we have in our various countries. The British Council in 2018 did some great work on the integration of refugees in TVET systems. And so there's a little snip here of TVET for refugees exists in all studied countries, but is never universally available to all. There's also a labour market segmentation whereby migrant workers tend to be concentrated in the low wage and therefore more insecure positions. And we're seeing a polarization of that labour market, specifically in construction, with some of the complexities that Oren was just describing around the segmentation of construction as a whole, and indeed more and more reliance on the contracting workers and the temporary work of those short-term contracts, which again leads to further issues for migrant workers. Migrants typically also have limited protections. They are often limited in what they can access in terms of social security benefits. As I mentioned earlier, the exclusion from state-funded training, and therefore there are high levels of informal employment, which means that they are particularly vulnerable to exploitation. However, we are seeing some ways to empower the workforce through the policy level, integration into vocational education, partnerships between incoming and outgoing VET institutes and indeed countries, as well as language training and prior learning recognition. We'll explore some of these in a bit more detail. So first of all, we have the development of recognition of prior learning, often referred to as RPL. We also hear about RCC, which is recognition of current competencies. There are some great initiatives. ASEAN, for example, has a qualifications reference framework mechanism, which compares the qualifications of member states. And that's definitely a great step for mobility within the ASEAN region, and indeed allowing that recognition to happen more seamlessly. But more of this policy is required to scale up these initiatives. The harmonization of TVET standards between countries would mean that RPL becomes less necessary, because in fact we're confident that what is being delivered in one country is very similar in standard to what is being delivered by another country. There is work underway between Australia and the UK indeed to start this standard harmonization. ASEAN and the ILO have recently worked on a declaration on skills mobility, recognition and development for migrant workers. And since 2023, a German program has successfully placed several cohorts of apprentices from Ethiopia and Mozambique within German construction companies. This has required a lot of work behind the scenes to ensure that the standards between the two countries were of an equivalent nature to allow for the apprentices to be hired in Germany. Inclusive TVET delivery. So this needs to be looked at in conjunction with immigration settings. Very often we find that vocational education is somewhat restricted in terms of what it can do for migrant workers in terms of integrating into the educational pathways. And this is most often because it clashes with the immigration settings. So very difficult to sort of look at vocational education for migrant workers without talking about the immigration settings that that accompany it, and very often restrict that. It would be very, very relevant to include a language or cultural component to other training. So, for example, if we are considering the upskilling of green skills on site, that would be a great opportunity to include some language and cultural training for the migrant workers that are undergoing that upskilling or reskilling. And last but not least is also the support services that could and should be made available. So this is having clear pathways and visibility of options and opportunities for training, as well as the pathways for RPL, which can be somewhat convoluted and difficult to navigate. Imagine doing it in a foreign language as well. In addition to available legal support to prevent a lot of the migrant exploitation that we do see, particularly in construction, as well as allowing for further career planning for our migrant workforce so that they can indeed see themselves investing more long term, both in the industry, but also in the country, in the host country that they are now part of. This brings us to the end of the presentation section. I will hold your attention for a little bit longer. If any of the things that we have spoken about today, you think, oh, I know of people that are already doing great work in that space, we would love to hear from you about that. So there's a QR code on your screens at the moment. This takes you to a survey link. We are looking for examples of innovative learning practices that are addressing some of the situations that we've outlined today. We will use these in two ways. Firstly, we will use these in reference in our final project report for this current expert group on construction. It means that it gives us concrete real-life examples that we can explore to understand what's working and how these opportunities might be scaled and adopted and adapted elsewhere. The second way that these will be used is once selected, they will be listed on the Univox Innovative and Promising Practices page, and there's a link on screen that can be made available to you after the presentation as well. But this is a great tool. If you haven't discovered it yet, I do encourage you to go and explore it further. You can filter from certain countries, you can filter based on your areas of interest, you can filter on different industries, and it gives you examples of what is being done the world over that might provide you with part of a solution to a problem that you yourselves are tackling. Thank you very much for your attention. I will now stop sharing my screen and we can move on to the Q&A session. Candice, do we have any questions in our Q&A?
Yes, we have a question from Bonita. So Bonita asks, are you working with NZQA regarding RPL and RCC?
That's a great question, and that's actually on my to-do list, because as we're taking steps towards further efforts on RPL and RCC, that's one of the little scoping exercises that I'm about to undertake shortly as part of Concove's work, is understanding what currently exists, both at a provider level, but also at a national level. So I will be getting in touch with NZQA regarding RPL. Thank you for that, Bonita. Well, thank you very much, Katerina, for sharing the link in the chat as well to the ILP resource. What other questions do we have, Candice?
There's no more questions from the chat. And if there's any questions people have, then please reach out to us and we'll be able to answer it in the email.
So the end product of the BUILD project is a final report, very similar to what Katerina showed at the start. So this report will focus on the 3 key themes, obviously focusing within the construction industry. And this is why it's really important for us to have some of these ILPs so that we can illustrate some of our more theoretical arguments with some real practical examples of what's happening in the real world as these tangible solutions. The idea is that this provides everybody, TVET systems, policy advisors, construction employers and workers with a better understanding of how the integration between TVET and construction can happen to address some of these pressing needs. And Katerina has just shared the expert group from the last project, which is the hospitality and tourism one. The final report will be ready, so I need to get my dates right, towards the end of 2025. This is great feedback that shows that Oren and Manny were abundantly clear in their presentations, and you have no residual questions. Well done, Manny. Well done, Oren.
And if there's no further questions, I think we can close today's webinar. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us online. Katerina, thank you for the very early start on your end. We appreciate everyone's presence. Candice, very, very grateful for your technical workings in the background and for organising this for us. Have a great day ahead, wherever you may be. Ka kite.